This week's Writing Wednesday is about grammar and police brutality. Take a look at this tweet from the New York Times. Minneapolis, a photographer was shot in the eye. Washington, D.C., protesters struck a journalist with his own microphone. Louisville, a reporter was hit by a pepper ball on live television by an officer who appeared to be aiming at her. This tweet is garbage. It's infuriating. It is deliberately misleading. Not because these things didn't happen, but because the Times is manipulating their sentences because they're a bunch of cowards. To understand why, we need to talk about the grammar. Stick around if you're a fiction writer, this applies to you too. There's a concept in grammar called active voice versus passive voice. Look at these two sentences. Jack drove his car off the bridge. The car was driven off the bridge by Jack. In the first sentence, the subject, Jack, is actively performing the verb drive. This sentence is in the active voice. In the second sentence, Jack is still the one driving. The car isn't actively doing anything, it is passively having the verb performed upon it. This sentence is written in passive voice. Jack drove is active, the car was driven, passive. Active voice is almost always better than passive voice. But why? Aren't these sentences basically saying the exact same thing? There are a few elements to look at here. The first is brevity. You always want your writing to be tight and concise. The first sentence is 7 words long. The second sentence is 9 words long. You should never use 9 words to say what you could say in 7. You should not allow your sentences to waste your reader's time by rambling on with unnecessary words. So, by default, the first sentence is better. The second element to discuss is clarity. The way to make a sentence clear to your reader is to have the subject that is performing the verb and the verb itself as close to each other as possible. In the first sentence, they're right next to each other. Jack drove. Done. I know who's doing what within the first 2 words. Beautiful. In the second sentence, we don't even know who's doing the driving until the very last word of the sentence. And instead of being right next to each other, there are 4 words in between Jack and the action verb. This is much less clear than the first sentence, so again, the first sentence is better. The third element is accountability, and this is where police brutality enters the mix. Several people that I follow on Twitter pointed out that this was bullshit. Anthony Oliveira said, "This tweet should probably go in textbooks. 3 sentences laid back to back by the same publication, and ask students to note which use the active and which use the passive voice." Parker Malloy laid it out like this. Sentence 1, passive voice. Sentence 2, active voice. Sentence 3, passive voice, with a little chin scratcher there. Rebecca Tracer said it a little bit more directly. Passive voice is for when the state does violence. Active voice is for when a protester does. Got it. So what? Why would it matter? Active voice and passive voice still say the same thing, don't they? No, they don't. Let's go back to our original example. In the first sentence, when Jack drives the car off the bridge, it is clear that he's responsible for it. He's doing the driving, it's his fault. He is accountable for what happens to the car. In the second sentence, accountability has shifted away from Jack. Because the sentence lacks brevity and clarity, it's less clear that he's to blame. It makes it seem as if the car just happened to drive itself off the bridge. In an example about a fictional character driving a fictional car, this may not matter so much. But when the news around the world is the struggle between police officers and protesters, the difference between active voice and passive voice means everything. Eve Ewing said it the most clearly here. When I was younger, I thought of passive voice as a wonky grammar thing that didn't matter. I've realized that in both journalism and academia, it can be a way to avoid assigning accountability to anyone for their actions. A gun was discharged. Data were analyzed. By a ghost? A photographer was shot in the eye. By whom? The sentence is so passive that it drops the subject that performs the verb entirely. It was a cop who shot the photographer. A reporter was hit by a pepper ball. By whom? Is a pepper bullet something that just comes out of nowhere to hit people? No, a cop shot the reporter. The New York Times uses passive voice when police officers use violence because they lack the courage to say it clearly and hold cops accountable for their actions. However, they have no problem using active voice in the second sentence. Protesters struck a journalist. It's clear, it's deliberate, it's to the point, it holds the subject that performs the verb accountable. But by comparison, it is cowardly to use active voice to describe violence committed by protesters and passive voice to describe violence committed by police officers. Because when news publications use passive voice, they are refusing to assign accountability to police departments that are committing violent acts. And it matters, especially in a time when the only part of the article people read is the headline. This series of sentences makes it seem like protesters are assaulting people, while the people who are hurt by police are just sort of randomly encountering violence somehow. And it's not an accident. The New York Times certainly knows the implications of using active voice versus passive voice, as well as a former high school journalism teacher. News outlets are tripping over themselves to avoid saying outright that police officers have been beating the out of non-violent protesters. This is journalistic malpractice, and it matters. As I mentioned in a video on Monday, keep it right there. The whole point of journalism is to hold power accountable. The police have the power. They have the full force of the government behind them. They have multi-billion-dollar budgets. They have the guns and the tear gas and the handcuffs and the tasers and the rubber bullets and the pepper spray, and they've been using them aggressively, though you wouldn't know it from some of these headlines. The only news article that I saw that had the courage to say that police officers were actively committing violent acts was in Slate. Police erupt in violence nationwide. That's an active sentence. That's how you write with brevity and clarity. That's how you hold someone accountable. Your Writing Wednesday homework for this week: find some news headlines that are written in passive voice. Shouldn't be too hard. Then see if you can rewrite them using active voice. So instead of "a reporter was hit by a pepper ball," you could say "a police officer shot a reporter with a pepper ball." Try to find 3 passive voice headlines that you could rewrite in active voice and see how that changes the meaning and purpose of the sentence. In your own writing, make sure you're using active voice. Try one of these 2 things. Either write your whole next scene making sure that each character is acting deliberately and it's written in active voice, or see if you can spot any sentences you've written in passive voice in your previous writing. Change them to active voice and see how that scene comes alive. That's the whole point. If you're going to say somebody did something, then say it. Make that character accountable for their actions. Don't be a coward. That's a little lesson for the New York Times. That's it, but be sure that you come back on Tuesday, June 30th to talk about The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. We'll be discussing it live on this channel at 7 p.m. Central. Thanks for watching.